Good
Reviewing
morning.
the financial image, I think you said.
Yes,
we
right. We're
dive
going to
into
start with the
military
financial image. Last week we just kind of breached the topic, saying that
49.
we are going to look at several biblical images of the atonement.
Yeah.
And remember, Guthrie says the images do not describe a theory. Each has value and each has limitations, and all four are needed in interpreting Good Friday. So, remember Guthrie basically said, look, these images are brought up by humans, and if they're brought up by humans, what does that mean?
The 40.
Yeah, they're going to have cracks, they're going to have
Shortcomings.
holes. They are our way of trying to understand something that's out of our world. And I don't mean to sound, I didn't say it to sound flippant, but it is. It's something spiritual. It's something that we don't fully understand, and we try to understand. So we come up with examples that a banker or, a soldier, these are images that we understand. So all have their pros, but all have their cons according to Guthrie. So we're going to start out this morning by looking at the financial image, and I'm going to read a portion from Guthrie on page 252 of his book. The financial image. The scene is a slave market or a prison camp. There sit captives who have lost their freedom. But a man steps up and pays the price or gives the ransom money. Did we talk about this?
We did this.
Yeah.
You just said you were going to review it.
Oh. Yeah, that's right, we did. All right, so remember we talked about this, and, we say, okay, well, some of this has merit, but who are we paying ransom to?
Right.
Right? Who is God paying ransom to, right? Yeah. And a lot of times, people will say, it's a devil. It's the devil. In a moving way, this image describes us as a trapped people who cannot free ourselves from the captivity of our sinfulness. It describes Jesus as one who at great cost to himself sets us free. But we ought not to try to make the image say more than this. Remember, when we push it too far, and when we ask who the ransom is paid, that's when the image begins to break down. Mm-hmm. As if God owes the devil anything.
Right.
As if God can't say, you know what? Yeah.
Poof.
Yeah, you're one of my creations.
Right.
So, exactly. But the image does make some sense when you look at it just strictly as a ransom being paid. But again, Guthrie would say if you push it too far, then it begins to break down and disintegrate.
Right.
All right, so let's then look at the military image. The scene is a battlefield. God and the devil are at war for possession of people whom the devil has stolen from the kingdom of God and carried off to his kingdom of darkness. A warrior from God invades the territory ruled by Satan to bring these people home again where they belong. It is a deadly, real battle. On Good Friday, God's warrior is killed, and the power of darkness seems to be victorious. But on Easter morning, he triumphs over them and frees the captives. Jesus is the victor, who delivers us from Satan's realm of darkness and death to bring us into God's realm of light and life. All right, so the military image. Not very popular in Reformed tradition. So if this one seems a little foreign to us, it should, because it's not one that we really talk about that much within our traditions. So, and where do our traditions start? Who's kind of the... Calvin, right. So whenever you hear the Reformed tradition, your mind should automatically go to John Calvin, right? And from John Calvin, then it's taken to different places, right? Mm-hmm. And ours, of course, is through John Knox, who says, I love this idea. I'm going to take this back to Scotland and toss out the Anglicans. And that's basically what happens. All right, so it's not very popular within the Reformed tradition, often used by the Eastern Orthodox and Lutheran traditions. And we have a hymn. What's the hymn down here?
A mighty fortress
is our God. Fortress is our God. Who wrote that, by the way?
Luther.
Martin Luther.
Oh, Luther wrote it.
Yeah, Martin Luther wrote it. It's a very old.
Right.
I love it. I'm not going to lie. I think it's one of my favorites.
No, I mean, as any Star Wars fan or whatever, I mean,
yes.
I mean, we're drawn to that image, and I love the even though if it's not theologically correct, I love this angels and devils in this
Surely.
celestial
Surely.
battle.
Think about it. We love good versus evil.
Right.
It's, when you watch, come on, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, how do you not root for Indiana Jones? Unless you are part of the National Socialist Party. I mean, you root for him because he is everything that Americans dream to be, right? He's a professor. He is handsome. He's a great guy. He wants to take these, the treasures he finds, and what does he want to do with them? They belong in a museum where everyone can enjoy them, right? They don't belong on a private collector's shelf somewhere. He battles Nazis on the weekend. I mean, he's just like the epitome. I mean, and when you think about that, it's this clear, for us at least, good versus evil battle that you see take place within that movie, right? The bad guys are clearly marked. You know who to root for and you know who to root against. So yes, you're correct. We do love that. We love a story like that. So Star Wars, yeah, that's a great example of that, right? And of course, that whole, what's the author that Lucas borrows from his book on myth, The Power of Myth.
Campbell.
Joseph Campbell. And this exactly goes to the next line. Cosmic battle seems too mythological at times, right? We think about that. When we think about spiritual warfare, okay, it might go on, and maybe perhaps it does go on, but we can't see it.
Right.
So it kind of loses that for us in some places because we can't see it. It goes on. If it goes on behind the scenes.
Right.
Right. All right. The good, the bad, and the good, literal or imagery. Right? So we get the idea. And then, of course, we border something else. If we push this one too far, we border something heretical, and that's dualism.
Yeah.
Right? You give the devil way too much what?
Credit. Power.
Credit. Power. Yeah. That he actually had a chance, that he actually had, the ability to win this fight.
Right.
Yeah, so that is where you can become, this is where this one begins to break down. But again, just because we don't see this image that much within the Reformed tradition doesn't mean that there are other traditions that do use this image, right? And we talked about a couple, Eastern Orthodox and Lutheran traditions. And so we have to understand as Presbyterians, just because we understand things one way doesn't mean that we have the corner of the market on theology, right? We don't. This is how we follow things.
We have the best theology, but...
I mean, I would agree with that. But it's not the only one, right? It's not the only one, exactly. There are a lot of different traditions, a lot of different churches, and we just have to understand that. All right, so... let me read a paragraph that kind of ties that one together.
Okay.
This dramatic image of the work of God in Christ emphasizes the seriousness both of our predicament and of God's love. We cannot free ourselves from the evil forces that dominate us. But God cares enough about us to enter into a costly struggle to rescue us from them. The disadvantage of this image and of the financial image is that they make us only a prize to be bought or fought over. The battle and ransom imagery explain the difference in our status as a result of the work of Christ, but they say nothing of a change in us. The sin to which we are slaves or prisoners is not only something outside us, but something in us. Are we ourselves any different just because we are moved from one place to another, or from the possession of one person to that of another? How are we any freer for God and for other people because of the work of Christ? Other images are necessary to deal with this question left unanswered by the ransom and battle images. All right. So how Guthrie ends his piece is saying that, okay, well, what about the sin? It's still there. still there. How do we deal with that? All right, so the next one is the sacrificial image. The scene is now a place of worship with a bloody altar where sacrifices are offered. There stand guilty people who deserve God's wrathful punishment. A priest comes forward who is the mediator between God and the people. He makes a sacrifice to atone for the people's sin. Blood is shed, a life is offered up. It is a sign of the people's sorrow for their disobedience, their offering of their own lives to God, and a cleansing from the stain of their sin. But this priest is different from all other priests in what he sacrifices is not the life of an animal or a bird, but his own life. He lets his own blood be shed to make peace again between the people and God. He himself is the lamb that is slain. He suffers as a representative of sinful people so that they may be reconciled with God. And good morning. All right, so what we're talking about, Alejandra, is the different images, different biblical images of atonement and how people understand them. So we started with the financial image, actually last week, the military image, and now we're on the sacrificial image. All right, so Guthrie opens up by saying this imagery occurs throughout the New Testament. So this one people are very familiar with, right? It is a dominant imagery in the book of Hebrews, right? So now we're starting to see some images that people are pulling heavily out of the Bible. It works with what? What's the third bullet?
Jewish sacrifice.
It works exactly with the Jewish sacrificial system. It makes sense, okay. But blood theology is not very popular. It's bloody, right? It used to be very popular. And where do we see evidence of this? It's a very neat place of this blood theology, the power of the blood in theology. I just gave you a huge hint.
Communion.
Close. Think about worship, and not so much in how we do, but you might have to go back one book. Think about it.
So one thing that is kind of very obvious is the cross in the Catholic Church. Jesus is really,
Okay.
really
Yeah.
big.
Yes, good.
Covered blood from here, from the hand, the
Yeah,
feet,
that's part of it.
dripping.
Yeah, the crucifix, most definitely. But for us, we don't use a crucifix.
Sure.
Hymnals. Hymns. And you might hear some old-time Christians say, well, we need to bring back some of those old, blood hymns, right? The power of the blood, the cost of the blood. And this is where you see the theology. Now, as we have moved from the old blue hymnal to the red hymnal to the blue hymnal, where we have an older version. There's a new hymnal that's even pushes past what we use. So what it says is we have to pay attention to the actual culture itself, right? So this image has fallen in favor, right? So that's one of the detractors of this image. And then the final thing Guthrie says, must not become too complacent. So, let's go ahead and look and see how Guthrie describes this. When the New Testament was written, the sacrifice of animals was a familiar part of worship. So, it was natural to interpret the death of Jesus as the shedding of blood to atone for our sins. We no longer worship in this way, and it's hard for us to understand what the sacrificial system meant to the people who practiced it. Many people in our time are repulsed by a blood theology that is perhaps the main disadvantage of this imagery for us. But if we can overcome our aversion to the bloody rituals of the ancient Jews, we can see that this imagery says something very important. It points to our guilt and need for what? Redemption, forgiveness. Good. Our estrangement from God and the need for reconciliation. The shed blood of Jesus emphasizes in a shockingly realistic way his unlimited love for us and the cost he was willing to pay to help and to heal us. One danger of using sacrificial imagery to speak of the significance of Jesus' death is that it can easily be corrupted in a way similar to the way the sacrificial system in ancient Israel was corrupted. The prophets warned the people of Israel that God was sick and tired of their sacrifices and would not listen to their prayers so long as the reconciliation to God promised in their religious rites did not find an echo in their life together. This warning also applies to Christians who think that Christ's sacrificial death for us is permission complacently to settle down in our personal and social sinfulness, confident that God will automatically forgive because Jesus paid it all. All talk about sacrifice, even Jesus' self-sacrifice for us, is empty religiosity if we do not cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, and care for those who, like orphans and widows, cannot help themselves. What would the prophets say to modern Christians who divide up sides to support either a church that sticks to proclamation of salvation through the sacrificial death of Christ, or a church concerned with issues of social justice? So, the danger, according and Guthrie would say this one probably holds more water than the others. But there are areas that we need to be cautious of. And theologically speaking, in the Reformed tradition, we call this cheap grace. What is cheap grace?
What you just explained.
Yeah, I'll do whatever.
I can sin and then I'll...
Yeah, I sin and then I just ask for God's forgiveness. Almost like, what was those toys we had as kids? The Etch-a-Sketch. You can draw on it and then just shake it. Oh, it's all good. I'll
Right.
start over again. And I'll do the same thing this week and shake it again and be good. And we call that cheap grace because it's saying, you keep doing this and, you think that, you just swipe an eraser on a board and it's all clear, or hit a delete button of some sort. As Guthrie states, even Jesus' sacrifice for us is empty religiosity if we do not cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the orphan, and care for those who, like orphans and widows, cannot help themselves, as an example. You have to do something with it, right? And this is where James's epistle comes in so strong. James says, get to work. Get to work. You know who Jesus is, and big whoop, so does the devil and all his men. It's just, get to work. Show me that you are saved. Show me that you know who Jesus is. Show me that you belong to him. Because knowing who Jesus is, like according to James, says, so what? The devil knows who Jesus is. What does that mean? That means nothing, right? And this is where James's epistle comes in like an uppercut. I mean, it just hits because he makes a lot of sense. And cheap grace is extremely damaging because it's kind of like this smoke. So what? And this is the danger of it. This is what Guthrie means by must not become too complacent. That's where cheap grace comes in, right? So, the blood covers all the sins. It does. It does, but it's not like this eternal get-out-of-jail-free card that you get in Monopoly. You can't do that. You're abusing the system. And this is where this image breaks down. This is where this image breaks down.
But this complacency thing should be for all of the images.
I agree.
I don't know
Yeah.
why he's just
Yeah.
singling it out for.
I think because of the thing like with cheap grace. I think that's where he probably hones in on this because this one is because this abuse we see a lot. And it's not just a thought or a way to understand something, it's an actual practice. Like people will just say, I'm good, I ask for forgiveness, and then next week, I'm just same thing all over again. And ask for forgiveness, I'm good. And then, because a lot of times what we see, and I'm not saying that Jesus cannot forgive and that the blood of Christ does not cover, it does. It most definitely does. And I'm not saying that even people who do heinous acts are not available for God's redemption and forgiveness. They are. Think about Saul of Tarsus murdering Christians. I mean, and not only just murdering them, but taking leadership roles. He wants to be the CEO. I mean, of this mission. And so God shook his tree and shook it hard, and he is physically changed, spiritually, emotionally. He is changed. He is a changed being, right? There is proof of a conversion. So there is no limit to God's grace and God's redemptive power, right? But to use it almost as a reset button, that's where cheap grace comes in. And that's where Guthrie would warn and say, this one's good, but be careful. Do not be too complacent, right? It's not meant to do this. But Guthrie says that this is definitely this is a solid image that we can look at, that we see it from the Hebrew Scriptures, right? We get it from the New Testament, right? So this is definitely a solid image. All right, so the final one is the legal image. And I'm going to start. The scene is now a courtroom. God, the just judge, sits behind the desk, and the people who have broken the law stand in front of it to be tried. They hear the verdict. Guilty. They receive the sentence. Death. But a righteous man who has obeyed the law perfectly comes and stands beside the accused, takes a death penalty on himself, and suffers the consequences of their guilt in their place. Those who were enemies of the law, and thus of the judge also, are now acquitted and reconciled. Order is restored. They no longer have to fear the judge, but are free to go out to begin a new life. Now, this is prevalent in whose works, according to your notes?
Paul.
Paul. Yeah. So reading Paul's letters, this imagery, comes up a lot. We are familiar with these concepts of judge, law, guilt, verdict, sentence, justice, and reconciliation, not just from the Jewish works. And if Paul is talking about law, judge, guilt, verdict, sentence, justice, reconciliation, what is Paul other than just a Pharisee?
Greek.
He's a Greek, but what else?
Roman
citizen. He's a Roman citizen. And what was really big to the Romans?
Law.
Law. My God, I don't know if justice, but definitely law. Justice to some. Justice to some. But the law, that's where the English got their love for the law, and that's where we got our love for law and order. It comes from the Romans.
As I said, the first law school was in Beirut.
Is it really?
Beirut, it was a Roman law school.
Was it a Roman law school?
Huh.
And it was in Beirut.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's really. Are the ruins still there?
No.
I'm sure they've long ago. Some of them are still there, right?
Yeah, but not
A lot of many of the temples survive. But yeah, so Paul not only understands this concept of law and justice from the Hebrew side, he also understands it from the Roman side. All right, and this is probably why this image works very well with people from the Western world. It resonates. We get it. Although we get it, but the justice is not always divvied out, right? Theoretically, it should work perfectly, but it doesn't. But we understand this concept. We understand this image because of the influence of the Romans on Western civilization. We get it. We understand.
Include devil.
The
legal.
Let me see a little bit further what he says within this one. So the legal imagery is especially characteristic of Paul, Romans, Corinthians, Colossians. According to these texts, God is reconciled to us, or are we reconciled to God? Who does the reconciling? The imagery is more than any other in the confessions of the Reformed tradition. So this one gets zeroed in by Calvin and by the other people in the Reformed tradition. And so this one is loved by Reformed theology. So this one comes up very, very prevalent. What is said with the legal image is basically the same thing said with the other images the New Testament uses to speak of the meaning of Christ's death for us. It too describes our desperate situation before God and the undeserved love of Christ for us. But unlike some of the other imagery we have discussed, this imagery has the advantage of being immediately understandable to us. Concepts like judge, law, guilt, verdict, sentence, justice, reconciliation are all a part of our everyday vocabulary and experience. We get it. Even if you've never been in a courtroom, we get it, right? Whether you watch trials on TV or you learn about them in school, you have mock trials in college. I mean, we understand how the system works. We just do. Maybe you have friends who are lawyers who discuss how cases work. Maybe you sat on jury duty. We kind of get the idea of this. This is a part of our culture. So much that our jurors are chosen from who? Everybody, our peers. These are our jurors. And this is why, when we get, oh gosh, I got jury duty again. It's hard because you don't want to miss work and you don't want to, but then you think and say, the way that always brings me back in is if I was on trial, I would want someone to take this very seriously. And that kind of brings me back around. But on the other hand, the legal image raises the difficult questions similar to those raised by the other images, and by the preacher's object lesson with which we began this chapter. Does Christ taking the rap for us mean that we are now free to go on living however we please? Cheap grace. Can the guilt of some people be transferred to another? Is that fair to God to punish Christ for our sins? If, according to the New Testament, the Father and the Son will and do the same thing, how can we understand the Son's self-giving love in opposition of the Father's wrathful justice? The very familiarity of the legal imagery makes it all the more difficult to understand the meaning of Christ's death for us. So, again, when you push the image too far, right, it's just like laying in bed at night and thinking about the universe. Thinking about how big and vast it is, and it'll keep you awake for hours. Right? To where you...
Both of you.
What's that? That's right.
Both of you.
And the neighbors listen to country music too loud. You get this idea that you can finally get to the point, my gosh, our whole galaxy could be on the toenail of some giant that's walking around space somewhere, walking around his own schoolyard. And that's why I love the end of Men in Black, when these big aliens are playing marbles with the galaxies. And you say, my gosh, they could totally be, and you do. And so when we think about these four images, again, they all hold some merit, but they all have their cracks and holes. And it's not pushing them too far. It's not trying to over-analyze them, because when we do that, we see their own faults, right? We see the weaknesses to them. Because in essence, we are trying to understand something out of our world. We don't deal like this, right? This is something so big that when we try to describe it, when we try to grasp it and understand it, it's like, you get it somehow, but then like sand, it begins to slip through our fingers. Because yes, we can grasp at it and we can understand it, but when we think we fully got it, it slips through our fingers. Because with our minds, can we truly understand it? Plus, how great a God would God be if we can understand everything about God? And this is why it upsets me when you have ministers say, this happened for a reason. This happened because all the sinful people lived in that town. That's why the tornado came through. That's why the hurricane came through. That's why the attack came through, because of their sin. Oh, you must please, give me God's phone number. I mean, it's great. You talk to him on a regular basis. I don't have his number in my Rolodex. And so now that we have the atonement images of the New Testament in mind, we have seen something of their strengths and weaknesses. We will try to understand the one gospel as they all seek to proclaim. All right? So, now we look at God versus the gods. One way to get at the meaning of the doctrine of atonement in biblical religion is to contrast it with what atonement or reconciliation meant in other ancient religions and still means in some modern versions of them. People in the ancient world lived in terror before gods who were easily offended by disrespect and disobedience and quick to seek revenge and retribution. In order to live in order to live in peace and prosperity, people had to do what they could to appease, placate, or satisfy the angry gods. Prayers, good deeds, and above all, sacrifices were the means by which they sought to ease their guilty consciences, atone for their sins, and win the approval of the gods. These religious rituals and moral achievements were also ways of manipulating the gods into giving people supernatural help. What their gods thought of them and how their gods acted toward them depended upon what the people or priestly representative did to butter them up and buy them off. Sometimes this cost people a great deal, but with their piety and sacrifices, they paid the price and they won the salvation. It was basically do-it-yourself religion. The situation of estrangement and need for reconciliation we have described is not so strange to us. That is why biblical religion can be so easily twisted into superstitious, primitive paganism in our time, too. But the God of the Bible is different from the gods, and the Christian doctrine of atonement is different from what we have just described. We see the difference when we look at the character of the God we meet in the history of Israel, and above all, in Jesus Christ. Or to put in terms of the church's doctrine of the Trinity, we see the difference when we remember the Trinitarian rule that the work of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit cannot be separated or set in opposition to each other, for what one wills and does is what the others will and do also. So it's not just that Jesus feels the pain of the cross. He might only feel the physical pain as a human, but the pain of rejection, the pain of loss, grief, maybe anger, is felt by all the members of the Godhead. Right? So when we think about people in the ancient world, we think about their understandings of gods. And what is it? If the crops do well and you live in Rome, Ceres, she's happy. Right? If you go to the bar and you drink lots of wine, you get a blessing from Bacchus and you stumble home. If bad things happen, if you're sailing on the sea and your ship is dashed against rocks, you really made Neptune angry somehow, right? And we can see this in ways, and we also see it in very concrete ways. I know I've told you the story before. During the First Punic War, the Romans are fixing to do battle with the Carthaginians, right? Big naval battle. And the Romans had these things called sacred chickens, and they kept them in little cages, and they'd bring them on board their ships. They'd bring them everywhere. And you would put food out, and if the chicken would eat, good omen. You're going to have a great day, right? So the naval commander puts out the chicken, opens a little door to the cage, puts the grain down, and the chicken refuses to eat, right? This is right before a huge battle that they're getting ready to take place. So the commander gets enraged and puts the chicken back in the cage and says, well, if the chicken's not hungry, maybe they're thirsty. And he takes the whole cage with the chicken and tosses it over the side of the boat. And of course, what happens to a chicken in a cage in the water? It sinks, and what happens to the chicken? Drowns, dies. So the Romans go in and they go to battle, and it's like one of the worst naval defeats in their history. I mean, they just get schooled by the Carthaginians that day. Many, many thousands of Romans die. funny enough, not the commander. He lives. And when he gets back to Rome, there are plenty of people who saw what happened with the chickens. And so I want to say he's put to death over that, or he's in a lot of heat. So you can see how superstitious they are, and their ideas about the gods, right? And so, but superstitions, they bleed into our side too. We are very superstitious, some more than others. My own family, I can't tell you how many different superstitions growing up in my houses, and having, the Italian horns, the gold horns. I wore a horn around my neck for many years. My grandmothers had the red horns above the door frames of their houses to ward off evil spirits, to ward off the evil eye. The horns, putting curses on people. This is my own family. This is like, this is within my lifetime. I remember these people doing this. So
this kind of came up this week because did you guys read about the guy who ripped off the McDonald's Monopoly game? It was,
I heard
in the news and stuff this week.
What?
It was it got busted right around the time of 9/11. That's why it kind of got buried. But this guy basically, all through the 90s, all the $1 million McDonald's prizes went to his friends. He worked in security, or they weren't necessarily close friends, but people that he would connect with, and he would get a cut of it, and they would get the majority of it, and they would make up fake stories, and you can watch.
Really?
You can watch the videos of these people being, I won, and it's no, it was completely fake. The reason I brought that up, outside of the fact that you should look it up, it's a fascinating story of just, I don't know. I mean, we are awful people, but. Because he was superstitious and went to psychics all the time and stuff like that. And it also makes me think, if you ever read or seen the movie Drugstore Cowboy. Because I was thinking about that, because he is super superstitious. I mean, he's you put a hat on the bed, we have to lay low for 6 months. And I find it interesting that when people are living lives of crime, they can't really turn to God. And so I think that can make you more.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Drugstore Cowboy.
Drugstore Cowboy. It's about that they basically break into pharmacies and take drugs.
Oh, that's what you're saying, drug dealers. That's why you're mentioning that.
Yeah.
The drug dealers in Colombia are super superstitious.
I mean, look at sports.
And very pious.
Yeah.
That too.
Look at sports.
Right.
I mean, and this is, it's in a harmless way. No one's getting hurt. But I mean, they wear rally caps, right? They turn their baseball caps inside out. In hockey, if your team makes the playoffs, what don't you do the entire playoffs? No one watches hockey in here?
Nope.
No.
You don't shave. I mean, so by the Stanley Cup, when you get to the final, I mean, those two teams, I mean, who grows a nice beard and who doesn't. I mean, they're grizzly. But that is a very big thing. You do not let a razor touch your face. How many baseball players wear the same stinky cap the whole season? How many baseball players or football players won't change their socks? I mean, so these superstitions can be very big or very small. But I mean, we see them from when we're very little. I mean, how many times, you walk to school and don't step on a crack? Bad things. Break your mother's back. And we all know them. See, I grew up in a totally different place, but I started it and Patty finished it.
Right.
And it's not, and these things are so prevalent. So superstitions are very, very prevalent within our society. So the ancient world had them. The ancient world was very superstitious. All right, now, a lot more than just us. I mean, they would sacrifice animals. They would do things, right, because of superstitions. So this is, part of, when you think of Christianity and the ancient Jews, some of what it is they are being separated from their neighbors, right? Think about some of the Hebraic law is separating them. You know, your enemies might boil a calf in its mother's milk. My people do not. Speaking of God and looking at the Mosaic law. So, you know, some of them are moved away. But when we think about that and how it affects the ancient Hebrews, and the ancient church were also ancient Hebrews at first, before it becomes predominantly Gentile, it impacts that. And then when it starts moving around the Mediterranean world, now it's different superstitions. Now you encounter superstitions from the Greeks and from the Romans and from the Gauls and from people in North Africa. It happens. You can't keep it all out. Because we are, I mean, for whatever reason, we are superstitious creatures. Because we can't explain everything. And when we can explain it, it's still more interesting to say the Bermuda Triangle sucks down ships because of some magical force, and not looking at, well, what does science say about that? Yeah. But it's more interesting hearing Leonard Nimoy talk about it from those shows from the 70s, you know, about Bigfoot and Nessie and all these things, because why? It's interesting. It's interesting. Sure it is. You know, I mean, so we think about superstition, and it's not just for children. I mean, it impacts adults. It impacts how we look at theology. And Guthrie says it's not just the ancient people in the Bible who deal with it. It's also us. It's also people in the postmodern world that also deal with it too. All right, we will continue next week with the love of God.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.